June 1942. Britain had been at war for 3 long years. Every night German bombs fell on London. Every morning families counted their dead. In kitchens across the country, mothers stretched thin rations of butter, sugar, and meat to feed hungry children. Steel was precious. Fuel was scarce. Every nail, every scrap of metal, every drop of gasoline went to the war machine. The island nation stood alone against Hitler's empire, battered but refusing to break. In secret rooms deep inside the War Office in London, men in uniforms bent over maps of France. They studied the coastline with tired eyes. The problem was simple to understand but impossible to solve. If Britain wanted to invade France and push the Germans back, they needed to land millions of soldiers on the beaches. But soldiers need food. They need bullets. They need tanks and trucks and fuel. All of this had to come across the ocean on ships. And ships need ports to unload their cargo. The Germans knew this too. Hitler had ordered every port on the French coast turned into a fortress. Calais bristled with giant concrete bunkers and artillery guns. Cherbourg was ringed with mines and machine gun nests. Every harbour, every pier, every dock was guarded by thousands of soldiers. The German generals were confident. Let the British try to invade, they said. Without a port, any landing would fail within 2 days. The math was brutal and clear. British engineers worked day and night searching for answers. They drew plans and tore them up. They ran calculations that always ended the same way. Without capturing a working port immediately, an invasion was suicide. The soldiers would run out of ammunition. The tanks would run out of fuel. The wounded would die without medical supplies. Churchill demanded solutions, but his best minds had none to give. The invasion everyone knew had to happen seemed impossible. 300 miles from London, in the green hills of Devon, a different kind of thinking was taking place. Arthur Beckett stood on the muddy bank of the Tamar estuary, watching the tide come in. He was 58 years old, with weathered hands and a farmer's squint. His neighbours called him Odd Arthur, though never to his face. He had a habit of building strange things. Arthur's farm sat where the river met the sea. Twice a day the tide rose 15 feet. Twice a day it fell again. This made loading his small fishing boat a constant problem. At high tide, his dock was perfect. At low tide, the dock towered uselessly above the water, and Arthur had to carry everything down a slippery bank. It was back-breaking work for a man his age. For months, Arthur had been thinking, what if the dock could move with the water? What if it could rise and fall with the tide, staying level no matter how high or low the water got? His neighbours thought he was touched in the head when he started collecting old oil drums from the village. They shook their heads when he hauled timber and concrete blocks down to the water's edge. By late autumn, Arthur had built something the village would talk about for years. It looked like a raft made by a child. 40 oil drums lashed together supported a wooden platform 20 feet long. Flexible wooden walkways connected it to the shore, hinged so they could tilt up and down. The whole contraption floated on the water, bobbing gently with the waves. When the tide rose, the platform rose. When the tide fell, the platform fell. But the surface always stayed level. The fisherman laughed. "What's the point, Arthur? The tide does what it does. Just carry your boxes like the rest of us." But Arthur said nothing. He just loaded his boat at low tide, whistling softly. Then he loaded it again at high tide, the platform adjusting naturally beneath his feet. No carrying, no slipping on muddy banks. The dock did the work. Arthur was not an educated man. He had left school at age 12 to work his father's farm. He could barely write a proper letter. But he could see what worked and what didn't. And he had solved a problem that had bothered him for 30 years. He felt quietly proud of his floating dock, even if everyone else thought it was ridiculous. One cold evening in December, Arthur sat by his fire and did something unusual. He wrote a letter to the Admiralty in London. His handwriting was shaky, his spelling was poor, but he tried to explain his idea. He drew clumsy pictures of his dock with a carpenter's pencil. He thought perhaps the Navy might find it useful somehow. He had heard on the radio that Britain needed new ideas for the war. This was his idea. It probably wasn't important, but he sent the letter anyway. In London, a junior clerk opened Arthur's envelope 3 weeks later. He barely glanced at the crude drawings before stamping the file, "Unsuitable, civilian crank." Into the cabinet it went, buried among hundreds of other letters from people who thought they could win the war with backyard inventions. The clerk forgot about it within an hour. But something strange happened. A copy of Arthur's letter had been forwarded to several departments as routine procedure. One copy landed on the desk of Hugh Iris Hughes, a middle-ranking civil engineer working on harbour projects. Hughes almost threw it away. The letter was barely readable. The drawings looked like they were made by a child. But something about it nagged at him. The principle was sound, even if the explanation was clumsy. A floating platform that moved with the tide. Hughes had been working for months on the impossible problem of how to unload ships without a fixed dock. Could something this simple actually work? It seemed too ridiculous to be real. On a grey Saturday in January 1943, Hughes drove his car down to Devon without telling anyone. It was probably a waste of petrol. He would look at this farmer's toy, confirm it was nonsense, and drive home. But as he stood on the muddy shore of the Tamar, watching Arthur's crude dock rise and fall perfectly with the tide, something shifted in his mind. Fishing boats came and went. Carts were loaded and unloaded. The tide moved 15 feet, but the work never stopped. The platform simply adjusted, floating naturally, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Hughes felt his heart begin to pound. "Good God," he whispered. "This madman might have just won us the war." He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and began sketching measurements, his pencil moving fast across the page. Arthur watched, confused but pleased that someone finally understood. Hughes barely looked up as he wrote. He was already calculating, already seeing how this simple principle could be transformed into something vast and vital. By the time the sun set over the Tamar that evening, Hughes knew he would return to London with more than photographs. He would return with hope. Hughes drove back to London through the night, his mind racing faster than his motorcar. Hughes drove back to London through the night, his mind racing faster than his motorcar. He carried photographs of Arthur's dock and a notebook filled with measurements. When he arrived at the War Office on Monday morning, he went straight to the planning department. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and strong tea. Maps covered every wall. Men in uniform and civilian suits hunched over tables covered with technical drawings. Hughes spread his photographs across the main conference table. A dozen engineers and military officers gathered around. They saw Arthur's crude platform of oil drums and timber bobbing on muddy water. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then someone laughed. "A farmer built this? This is what you drove to Devon to see." Another officer shook his head slowly. "Hughes, we have the best engineers in the Empire working on this problem. Cambridge men, Oxford men. And you think some countryside bumpkin has beaten them all?" But Hughes was ready. He pulled out his calculations. He explained the principle step by step. The platform floats, so it moves naturally with the tide. Flexible walkways allow access at any height. The system requires no pumps, no engines, no power source at all. Gravity does all the work. The tide rises, the dock rises. The tide falls, the dock falls. But the loading surface stays perfectly level. An older engineer named Williamson leaned forward. He had designed bridges across India and harbours in Singapore. His reputation was legendary. He studied the photographs without speaking. Then he picked up a pencil and began writing equations on a blackboard. The room fell silent except for the scratch of chalk. After 10 minutes, Williamson turned around. His face had changed. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "the mathematics are sound. If we scale this principle up dramatically, it could work. It could actually work." The contrast between what they were discussing and what they were looking at was almost funny. Arthur's ramshackle floating dock made of salvaged junk, and the massive artificial harbours they would need to invade France. It was like comparing a child's toy boat to the Queen Mary. But the principle was the same. The simple rural wisdom was solid. One officer muttered that it seemed almost embarrassing that nobody had thought of this before. "A farmer sees what we missed," he said, shaking his head. Within days, the project exploded into action. Engineers began designing what they called floating piers, or mulberry harbours. Arthur's oil drums became enormous concrete boxes called phoenix units. Some would be as tall as 5-story buildings. Some would weigh 6,000 tons. His timber walkways evolved into steel roadways strong enough to carry tanks. They would call these roadways whale pontoons. Each section would be 80 feet long and float on steel drums far larger than anything Arthur had imagined. The scale grew beyond comprehension. They would need 2 complete harbours. Each harbour would be as large as the port of Dover. But these harbours would be built in sections, towed across the English Channel, and assembled in open water off the beaches of France. It sounded like madness. But the math said it could work, and Britain had no other choice. Across the country, construction began in absolute secrecy. 45,000 workers were told they were building parts for a classified project. They asked no questions. In shipyards and factories from Scotland to Cornwall, giant concrete boxes took shape. The noise was deafening. Welding torches sparked day and night. Concrete mixers rumbled without stopping. The workers used enough concrete to pave a highway from London to Edinburgh. They used enough steel to build 300 warships. In March 1943, a black government car arrived at Arthur's farm. 2 men in dark suits asked Arthur to come with them to London. He should bring his good clothes, they said, and planned to stay 2 days. Arthur's wife packed his only suit and kissed him goodbye. She had no idea where he was going or why. Neither did Arthur. The drive to London took 6 hours. Arthur had never been to the capital before. The city stunned him. Buildings rose higher than church steeples. Motorcars and buses filled streets wider than his farm was long. People rushed everywhere, thousands of them, more people than lived in his entire village. The war had scarred the city. Bombed buildings stood like broken teeth. Rubble filled empty lots. But life rushed on around the destruction. The car stopped at a grey building with no sign on the door. Inside, guards checked papers and waved them through. Arthur followed the men down long hallways and through heavy doors. Finally, they entered a huge room filled with drawing tables. Dozens of engineers worked under bright electric lights. And on the walls, covering every available space, Arthur saw his idea transformed into something magnificent and terrifying. Technical drawings showed his floating platform expanded to the size of football fields. Cross-sections revealed steel and concrete structures that would have swallowed his farm whole. Wind calculations and wave charts covered entire blackboards. A scale model sat on a table in the center of the room. It showed a complete artificial harbor with roadways stretching from ships to shore, all floating, all rising and falling with imaginary tides. Arthur stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, unable to speak. One of the senior engineers approached him. His name was Lochner, and he had kind eyes behind thick glasses. "Mr. Beckett," he said, shaking Arthur's rough hand, "we wanted you to see what your idea has become." Arthur found his voice. "I don't understand, sir. I just made a little dock for my boat." Lochner smiled. "You solved a problem, Mr. Beckett. You showed us that docks don't have to be fixed to the ground. They can float and move. That simple insight has given us the key to France." Arthur walked slowly around the room, looking at drawings he could barely understand. The numbers were too large to grasp. One Phoenix unit alone would use more concrete than every building in his village combined. The steel roadways would stretch for miles. Ships the size of ocean liners would unload onto these floating piers. Tanks would drive across them. Thousands of soldiers would march across them every hour, and it would all rise and fall with the tide, just like his simple dock on the Tamar. An officer showed him photographs marked "Top Secret." These images showed work already underway. Massive concrete boxes under construction in dry docks, steel sections being welded together in factory yards. Arthur recognized the principle in every photograph. His principle. His ridiculous idea that the village had laughed at. But transformed. Made mighty. Made into something that might change the war. That night, Arthur lay in an unfamiliar bed in a London hotel. Through the window, he could hear the city murmur and growl. His head spun with what he had seen. He thought of his little dock back home, still bobbing gently on the Tamar, doing its simple work. He thought of these massive harbours they were building, thousands of tons of steel and concrete that would float across the channel. He felt very small and very proud and very frightened all at once. They had taken his knowing, his simple farmer's wisdom about tides and floating things, and turned it into a weapon of war. He whispered a prayer that it would save lives rather than cost them. The next morning, before driving home, the officers made Arthur sign papers. He could tell no one what he had seen, not his wife, not his children, not his neighbours who still laughed at Beckett's folly. The secret could cost lives if it leaked to the Germans. Arthur signed with his shaky handwriting and promised to stay silent. He would keep that promise for years. As his car pulled away from the grey building in London, Arthur looked back one last time at the window where he had seen his future written in blueprints and calculations. Somewhere in those rooms, men were working around the clock to turn his simple wisdom into weapons of liberation. The weight of that knowledge would travel home with him, a silent passenger he would carry for the rest of his life. Arthur returned to Devon a changed man, though no one could see the change on the outside. Arthur returned to Devon a changed man, though no one could see the change on the outside. He worked his farm as always. He tended his sheep and mended his fences. He loaded his fishing boat from his floating dock, while neighbours still called it Beckett's folly. But now, when Arthur stood on that simple platform of oil drums and timber, he knew something they did not. He knew that across Britain, in secret yards and hidden factories, men were building giants based on his small idea. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy in his chest. Spring turned to summer in 1943. Arthur listened to BBC radio every evening. The news spoke of battles in North Africa and bombing raids over Germany. The announcers never mentioned invasion, but everyone knew it was coming. Britain could not win by staying on its island. Someday, somehow, British soldiers would have to cross the Channel and fight their way into France. Arthur wondered if his floating harbours would be ready. He wondered if they would work. He lay awake some nights thinking about all the boys who would depend on those harbours to bring them food and bullets and medicine. His neighbours noticed he had grown quieter. He spent more time standing at the water's edge, watching the tide rise and fall. Twice a day, every day, his dock moved up and down, smooth as breathing. The mechanism was so simple it seemed almost alive. Oil drums provided flotation, hinged walkways allowed movement. Gravity did the rest. No human hand needed to adjust anything. Arthur had learned this wisdom from 30 years of watching water, and now that wisdom was crossing the ocean to war. The months crawled by. Autumn came, then winter, then spring again. In early June 1944, Arthur felt something change in the air. More military trucks rumbled through the village. More planes flew overhead, so many they darkened the sky. His wife said she felt it too, like the whole country was holding its breath. Something big was about to happen. On the morning of June 6th, Arthur woke before dawn. He made tea and turned on the radio while the sky outside was still dark. At first there was only music. Then, just after sunrise, the announcer's voice came through, shaking with emotion. The invasion had begun. Allied forces were landing on the beaches of Normandy. Thousands of ships had crossed the Channel in the night. Paratroopers had dropped behind enemy lines. British, American, and Canadian soldiers were fighting their way onto French soil. Arthur sat frozen in his kitchen chair. His tea grew cold in his hands. He thought of those beaches, of young men running through bullets and explosions. He thought of the ships offshore, waiting to unload supplies. He knew that within days, if the plan worked, his floating harbours would appear off those beaches. Everything depended on getting supplies to those soldiers. Everything depended on keeping them fed and armed. Everything depended on harbours that could work without ports. The BBC reported fighting throughout the day. The news was good, then bad, then good again. The Allies had established footholds on 5 beaches. Men were dying by the hundreds, but they were moving forward. Arthur worked his farm mechanically, his mind across the channel. That night, he could not sleep. He sat by his window, looking out at darkness, and prayed for boys he would never meet. Days passed. The radio reported that the Allies were holding their positions. More troops were landing, but German gunners watched with growing confusion. The tide went out, exposing wide stretches of beach. Normally this would stop all unloading. Ships would have to wait for high tide to come close to shore. But the Allied ships kept unloading. Boats shuttled back and forth constantly. Supplies poured onto the beaches without stopping. The Germans could not understand it. Then, starting on June 7th, something impossible began to appear off the Normandy coast. Massive concrete structures were being towed across the channel. Each one was the size of a city block and tall as an apartment building. They moved slowly, pulled by tugboats, barely visible through smoke and morning mist. German spotters reported these strange floating boxes to their commanders. No one knew what they were seeing. It looked like entire buildings were crossing the sea. Over the next 10 days, 2 complete artificial harbours took shape in open water. One grew off Gold Beach where British forces had landed. Another appeared off Omaha Beach where Americans had fought their bloodiest battle. The construction happened in chaos and under fire. German artillery tried to destroy the structures. Storms threatened to scatter them. But piece by piece, the harbours came together. The Phoenix units were sunk in carefully planned positions, forming breakwaters to calm the waves. Inside these protective barriers, the whale roadways were assembled and connected. Miles of floating steel pier stretched from the shore to deep water where the big ships waited. And just as Arthur had designed with his oil drums and timber, these massive piers rose and fell with the tide. At low tide, they dropped. At high tide, they lifted. But the roadway surface stayed level. Trucks could drive across them at any time. Tanks could roll from ship to shore without waiting for the perfect conditions. Arthur knew none of this yet. He only knew from radio reports that the invasion was succeeding. Supplies were reaching the troops. The beachhead was growing stronger each day. He allowed himself to hope that perhaps his idea had helped. Perhaps those engineers had made it work. On June 28th, the black government car returned to Arthur's farm. The same 2 men in dark suits stepped out. This time they brought a leather folder. Arthur invited them inside. His wife made tea and then left the room, knowing this was official business she could not hear. The men opened the folder and spread photographs across Arthur's kitchen table. These pictures were marked "Top Secret" in red ink. Arthur bent close to look. What he saw made his hands begin to shake. Miles of floating piers stretched across grey water. Ships were tied up to them, unloading trucks and supplies. Tanks drove across the roadways. Soldiers marched in long lines from vessels to shore. And beneath it all, beneath the activity and machinery and organized chaos, Arthur could see the principle. His principle. The piers rose and fell with the waves, exactly as his little dock rose and fell with the tide in the Tamar. One photograph showed the harbour from the air. The scale was stunning. The artificial port was as large as any natural harbour Arthur had seen in pictures. But it was built in open ocean, assembled from pieces, and it floated. The officer explained quietly, "Without these harbours, Mr. Beckett, the invasion would have failed. The Germans held all the ports. We could not capture one intact. Your floating docks allowed us to bring our own harbour with us. We are unloading 7,000 tons of supplies every day through these structures. tanks, ammunition, food, medicine, fuel, everything the army needs. Arthur felt tears running down his weathered cheeks. He was not a man who cried easily, but the weight of what he was seeing crushed something in his chest. He thought of all the soldiers those supplies were keeping alive. He thought of battles being won because guns had bullets and trucks had fuel. He thought of wounded men being saved because medical supplies could reach them. His simple idea, his ridiculous floating dock made of junk, had become this, had saved this, had made this miracle possible. The officer reached across the table and gripped Arthur's shoulder. "The entire High Command knows what you did, sir. Your name is in classified files. Someday, when the war is over and secrets can be told, people will understand. You gave us the key to France. You gave us a way to win." That night, Arthur walked down to his floating dock in the darkness. He stood on the wooden platform and felt it move gently under his feet as small waves passed beneath. Up and down, responding to forces older than any war. The moon reflected off the dark water. Somewhere across that water, in France, enormous versions of this simple machine were winning the war. Arthur had lived his whole life thinking he was nobody important. A farmer. A simple man with calloused hands and limited education. But now he understood something deeper. Every idea matters. Every solution counts. The great and the small all are needed. His had been small. But God had seen fit to make it useful, and in that usefulness, lives had been saved. Arthur Beckett, alone in the dark, whispered a prayer of gratitude and humility. He felt very small beneath the stars, but he also felt for the first time in his life that perhaps his life had meant something after all. He stood there for a long time, listening to the gentle lap of water against oil drums, feeling the platform move beneath his feet with the ancient rhythm of the tide. Across the channel, those massive harbors were still working, still saving lives, still bringing victory closer with every ton of supplies they delivered. But here, in this quiet corner of Devon, the principle was the same: rise and fall, work with nature, keep it simple. Arthur finally turned and walked back to his farmhouse, carrying the secret that would define the rest of his days. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. He stood there for a long time, listening to the gentle lap of water against oil drums, feeling the platform move beneath his feet with the ancient rhythm of the tide. Across the channel, those massive harbors were still working, still saving lives, still bringing victory closer with every ton of supplies they delivered. But here, in this quiet corner of Devon, the principle was the same: rise and fall, work with nature, keep it simple. Arthur finally turned and walked back to his farmhouse, carrying the secret that would define the rest of his days. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Church bells rang across Britain for the first time in 6 years. People danced in the streets of London. Soldiers began coming home. The nation celebrated, exhausted and relieved, and forever changed by what it had survived. In Devon, Arthur Beckett stood in his farmyard and listened to the bells from the village church. He thought of the mulberry harbours across the channel and wondered what would happen to them now. Over the following months, Arthur learned bits and pieces through carefully worded letters from the War Office. The mulberry at Omaha Beach had been destroyed by a terrible storm just days after it was built. But the British mulberry at Arromanches had survived and kept working. For 10 months, that artificial harbour had delivered supplies to the Allied armies. More than 2.5 million men had depended on it. 500,000 vehicles had rolled across its floating roadways. 4 million tons of supplies had moved from ship to shore across its steel piers. Without it, the march to Germany would have taken years longer. Perhaps it would have failed entirely. Now the war was won, and most of the harbour was being taken apart. The steel was valuable and needed for rebuilding. But some of the massive concrete Phoenix units were too big to move. They would stay in the water off Arromanches forever, monuments in concrete to the desperate ingenuity of wartime. Arthur tried to imagine these structures, but could not quite picture them. They were too large, too far beyond his experience. Life returned to its quiet rhythms on the farm. Arthur was 61 now, moving slower, his back bent from decades of work. His neighbors still used his floating dock and still called it Beckett's Folly, though the name had become almost affectionate over the years. None of them knew what Arthur knew. The Official Secrets Act kept him silent. He could not tell his wife the full story. He could not tell his children or his friends. The classification would remain in place for years, perhaps decades. But Arthur carried something with him always. One of the officers had given him a single photograph before leaving that final time. The photo was not supposed to exist outside official files, but someone thought Arthur deserved to keep it. It showed the Mulberry Harbour at Arromanches from the air, the floating piers stretching to the horizon like the skeleton of some vast creature. Arthur kept this photograph tucked inside his Bible. Sometimes when he was alone, he would take it out and stare at it, trying to connect what he saw with the simple dock bobbing outside his door. His grandson Peter started visiting more often after the war. Peter was 12 years old, sharp and curious, always asking questions. Arthur loved the boy deeply. They would walk together down to the dock, and Peter would help load the boat or mend the walkways. Peter asked once why grandfather had built such a strange dock when everyone else just used fixed piers. Arthur smiled. Because the tide does not wait for us, boy. We must learn to move with it, not against it. That is how you solve problems. You watch what nature does and work with it. The years passed. Arthur grew older. His hair turned white. His hands became stiff with age. But his dock kept working, rising and falling with the tide, asking nothing, giving everything. In 1952, the government began slowly releasing some information about the Mulberry Harbours. Newspapers printed stories about the great engineering achievement. They named the brilliant designers and the Cambridge professors who had made calculations. Arthur read these articles and said nothing. His name was not mentioned. He did not expect it to be. One day in 1960, when Peter was 25 and had just finished studying engineering at university, Arthur asked him to come to the farm. It was time, Arthur decided, to tell the boy the truth. They sat in the same kitchen where Arthur had seen those secret photographs 16 years before. Arthur pulled out his Bible and removed the worn photograph. He handed it to Peter without speaking. Peter studied the image carefully. He had learned about the Mulberry Harbours in his classes. Every engineering student knew the story. It was taught as one of the great achievements of the war. The ingenuity, the scale, the impossible made real. But Peter had never seen a photograph like this. The detail was extraordinary. He looked up at his grandfather with questions in his eyes. Arthur spoke slowly, telling the story from the beginning. How he had built his floating dock to solve a simple problem. How he had written a clumsy letter to the Admiralty. How an engineer named Hughes had visited and seen something no one else had seen. How his idea had grown into those massive harbours. How he had been sworn to secrecy. How he had carried this knowledge alone for 16 years. Peter listened without interrupting, his eyes growing wider. When Arthur finished, Peter looked at the photograph again with new understanding. "Grandfather," he said quietly, "they teach about the Mulberry Harbours at university. They tell us it was one of the greatest engineering projects in history. But they never mention you." Arthur shrugged. "I'm just a farmer boy. I had one small idea. Other men made it great. That is how the world works. The clever men get the credit. And that is as it should be. I am content knowing I helped." But Peter was not content. Over the following years, he became quietly obsessed with his grandfather's story. He researched the Mulberry Harbours. He found the engineers who had worked on the project and wrote them letters. Some remembered hearing about a farmer in Devon whose floating dock had inspired the initial concept. Others had never heard the story. The official histories focused on the technical achievements and the famous names. Arthur Becket was a footnote if he appeared at all. Arthur died in 1968 at the age of 84. He passed peacefully in his sleep. At the funeral, the small church was full of neighbors and family. No government officials came, no medals were presented. The vicar spoke of Arthur as a good man, a faithful husband, a loving grandfather, a skilled farmer. There was no mention of floating harbors or D-Day or world history. Arthur had requested it that way. After the funeral, Peter stood alone by his grandfather's floating dock. It was still there, still working after 26 years. The oil drums had been replaced many times, but the design remained unchanged. Up and down, it moved with the tide, as reliable as sunrise. Peter made a decision then. He would not let this story be forgotten. In 1972, Peter traveled to France. He took a ferry across the channel and drove to Arromanches. The little coastal town had grown quiet again after the war, but the remains of the Mulberry Harbour were still there. Massive concrete caissons jutted from the water like ancient ruins. At low tide, you could walk among them. Children played on them. Tourists took photographs. A small museum on the shore explained what they were and how they had worked. Peter stood on the beach and looked at the concrete remains. A memorial plaque near the museum listed the engineers and military planners who had designed the harbours. Famous names from Cambridge and Oxford. Brilliant men who deserved recognition. But there was no mention of a Devon farmer named Arthur Becket. Peter felt a deep sadness, but also a strange peace. His grandfather had not wanted fame. He had wanted to be useful. And he had been. The tide was coming in. Peter watched the waves wash over the ancient concrete. These structures had once floated, just like his grandfather's dock. They had risen and fallen with every tide, carrying the weight of tanks and trucks and the hopes of millions. Now they were fixed in place, slowly crumbling, returning to the sea. But they had done their job. They had helped win the war. And that was enough. Peter thought about all the other people like his grandfather, the unknown inventors, the dismissed dreamers, the simple folk with clever ideas that no one took seriously until desperation made people listen. How many wars had been won by such people? How many great achievements rested on foundations built by hands that history forgot? His grandfather had been one voice among millions, one small idea in an ocean of innovation. But his voice had mattered. His idea had counted. Walking back to his car, Peter looked out at the channel. Somewhere across that water, in a quiet Devon estuary, his grandfather's original dock was still working, still rising and falling, still doing exactly what it was meant to do. That dock would outlast the medals and the monuments and the history books. It would keep working long after everyone forgot why it mattered. And perhaps that was the truest measure of genius. Not fame, but usefulness. Not recognition, but results. Arthur Becket had seen a problem clearly and solved it simply. He had trusted that his small wisdom might be valuable. He had spoken up when he could have stayed silent. And in doing so, he had changed the world. The fact that the world did not know his name changed nothing. The soldiers who came home alive because supplies reached them, they were his monument. The victory that his floating harbours helped secure, that was his reward. History might forget Arthur Becket, but history happened differently because he lived.